During my PhD process in New York in the 90s, I started to notice a lot of performance that was using media on stage. And although there's a historical precedent for using different kinds of media, and certain people over time have been known for their use of projection and whatnot, like Joseph Svoboda. However, in the 90s, suddenly I started seeing screens and cameras, television sets on stage more and more. And I noticed that this was becoming a bit of a trend. And I got interested in it. I had seen a lot of work around that time that was using a lot of imagery, and there was, of course, a lot of spectacle happening on Broadway and whatnot. But this was happening more off-Broadway and in experimental spaces. And so I got very interested in it, but I wasn't quite sure what to do with it. At the same time, I was taking a class about the cyborg in literature, and we were reading theory and science fiction and different kinds of thinking about this notion of the cybernetic organism, the union between the human and the machine. And I got very interested in what might happen if I thought of this kind of multimedia performance as a sort of cyborg. So instead of the literal union between machine and human, I was noticing it in a more metaphoric context. So what happens to the body when it starts to unite with technology? So this was the beginning of my project, Cyborg Theater, Corporeal Technological Intersections in Multimedia. And over the years, I just saw a lot of performance. Anything that had to do with media, I would go see. And I just started to develop different ways of thinking about the body. So for me, because I come from a history, my own history is in dance and theater, I think I was always interested in the questions and the conditions of the body in contemporary society. And of course, this was a time when there were no cell phones, no mobile phones really even yet. And computers were still new. So things have changed quite drastically in a rather short period of time. And I think that theater has always reflected some of the things going on around it in society. So that's the starting point really of where my thinking was. I was also using concepts from that time period. There's a lot of theory happening at that time. So questions of the abject, the object, and the subject. What is a subject? Who gets to be a subject in society? Questioning notions of the human. And so I thought, well, what if I think about these three concepts and how technology might allow us to think differently about them? And I found that I could use those three concepts in terms of technology as well, from the lack of technology to a more subject technology on stage. So I created a kind of taxonomy model to begin to analyze the different kinds of performance that I was seeing at that time. And I've been looking at it ever since and been following multimedia performance ever since. But a lot of this is coming out of feminist ideas about the body. And I, of course, was very influenced by Donna Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto and the idea of how to think about feminism at that time period as maybe through affinities rather than essentialisms. And I was very interested in that. I think that these three concepts are a bit complicated to outline in an interview form, but the way you might think of them, even the body as object or a person objectified, for example, I noticed that in the work of the company, the Worcester Group, they weren't really working with traditional kinds of psychological acting styles. They were definitely removed at a distance. So I could look at them as kind of object bodies, and in relation to the technologies they used, how when they merge together, metaphorically of course, they become a cyborgian kind of figure. And my interest in the book was so how does that allow us to rethink notions of the object body or the objectified? How can this kind of work tell us something about the human condition, if you will? And of course, since then, I've been thinking more about other kinds of bodies as well, but that was the beginning of all of this, really. Well, the Cyborg Theater is really a term that I came up with to try to analyze the work I was seeing. So for me, it was in the early days of multimedia performance, if you want to call it that as an umbrella term. You could look at it in many different ways, and you can analyze it in many different ways. But at that time, when I started writing, there wasn't a lot of analysis about, what is happening on these stages. In fact, a lot of it at the time was gimmicky, so the Broadway kinds of spectacle, you get the different kinds of big projections and things like that, and people using technology for the sake of it, because they have access to it. But I was more interested in how to think about the kinds of integrations that I was seeing on stage. So Cyborg Theater is one mode of analysis, and it's about breaking down the body and technology into these different aspects, the abject, object, and subject. And when they combine in different ways, how it asks different questions. So not all multimedia performance is the same. And I think it does different things. So that was really what I was after, was a kind of way of thinking about performance using media that could tell us something about the body, and really rethinking concepts of the body, of the able body versus the disabled body, the objectified, feminist questions. All of these things come into my thinking in the book. Well, I've continued to see as much multimedia performance as I can over the years, and a few years back now, I was asked to work with a few other people to come up with a performance and media taxonomies book. So my collaborators, Sarah Bae-chung and David Saltz, and we've created a book that proposes 3 different models, and each of us talk through our way of analyzing multimedia performance. Of course, there are many, and one of the things that we hope to do in this book is to open up a mode of thinking about it, so that we're hoping to develop a website around it so we can invite other people to share their ways of thinking and their analyses of multimedia performance as well. And in that book, I decided to rethink this taxonomy of the Cyborg Theater. So what would happen if I used these terms, which to me seemed a bit dated? What would happen if I used them again today? How might I rethink the project? And in doing that, I started looking at a lot of work through this lens again. And what I found was that we've become so comfortable with the technologies in such a short amount of time. And in fact, they have become more a part of us. So in a sense, although they're not literally implanted in us, sometimes it feels that way when we have the phone in our hand constantly. So I noticed that now that we've absorbed this notion of technology, it's much more comfortable. And so what it's allowed, the trend that I notice in this book, and of course there are many other ways of looking at this, but was that many of the practitioners who were using technology on the stages in the years that I was focusing on this new part of the project were using technologies to rethink historical moments or forms. So for example, I went to a wonderful piece by a company called the Paper Cinema, I believe, who were doing a retelling of the story of Odysseus, but through a technological kind of shadow puppetry. So the work they were doing was very beautiful. It was really a kind of new way of doing old forms and old stories. And actually that's what I started to notice, was how many people using large technological mise en scène, were doing it in order to tell stories anew. So it wasn't about necessarily coming up with new forms, and it wasn't using these technologies to develop the things in new ways. It was really about being able to look back, and with a comfort and an ease that I think is only because we've become so familiar with the technologies around us. So it's very interesting. Someone like Katie Mitchell was doing a Fraulein Julie, a Miss Julie, and she did it through her technique, which is to use a lot of camera work and it kind of creating almost a film on stage that you watch. But she was doing it through the eyes of the Christine, the maid in the play, instead of Miss Julie, and we got to look in as almost a surveillance kind of thing. We were looking into the rooms, and we got to see this. And in a way, this also felt like a return to naturalism when we were beginning to look up close to microscopes. So, you know, this is an interesting thing, I think, that I noticed was this historical, you know, looking back at history through these lenses. So over the years, and I'm not sure how this parallel works, but I've become, through my interest in the non-human other on stage, and in my theorization of the Cyborg Theater, I begin to think about technology as a subject on stage. So through this, I started to look at other non-human figures and how this cyborg relationship might work, which has led me to working with animal studies and animality. So it's interesting, people say to me, how did you go this big jump from technology to animals? And actually, for me, it's very organic. So it's about not looking at the non-human and beginning to incorporate thinking that is about affiliations and, you know, affinities and things like this, so that it's not just the human that we're thinking about. And in this time that's being called the Anthropocene, where it's human-driven, I think it's more important than ever to begin to look at the non-human as well. So this work has developed, my work has developed around that kind of thinking. And I'm not so interested in thinking about live animals on stage. That's not really where my work is. I continue to think about technologies, and now my next project is working towards the technologization of animals and the ideas of animality and performance, and what this might be able to tell us about these bodies on stage. In a lot of the work I'm talking about, they're not actual bodies. They're thinking, they're body parts or roboticized bodies, or thinking about the animal in performance in a way that isn't about the live animal in performance. So I'm working on that project now, and I think it's very important that we start to expand our thinking outside of the human. Although my focus is on questions of animals and animality, I'm also very interested in artists working with bioart, or working with other life forms. So, for example, Orlan, the famous performance artist Orlan, did a piece called The Harlequin Coat, where she co-cultured her own cells with cells from many other species, and she put them in petri dishes, and the cells were growing in a hybrid form together. And I was very interested in work like that, because it makes us look differently at the kinds of organisms. So it's not just about the human, and it makes us really focus on how we see and how we see the human in performance.